is more about more people, basically having a sense of history, basically, whatever that may be. And I'm going to focus more on that and the interplay of various, in this popular consciousness and the interplay of various actors, agents and ideas within the domain and outside of the domain, how they interact with academic worlds as well sometimes, very engage in a very deeper way, sometimes they do not engage in a very deeper way. So the questions that I was going to ask to myself and now to you, which becomes the premise of this presentation today is, does our historical consciousness impact the way we see, understand or engage with monuments? And when I say monuments, then I say monuments and connected histories. And the reverse of it, which is basically two memories, events, politics, stories, folklore connected with monuments, impact the way we understand history. Right? So both these things. And within these two things, there are two sub-questions. One is that why am I talking about monuments? What makes the monuments so special, basically? And two is that what goes into the making of this, what we call the popular consciousness, the making of popular consciousness. And yesterday I have talked about monuments being special because of all the different ways in which people consume histories in their day-to-day life, formal or informal. Monuments and artifacts have a very specific positioning and a very unique positioning. And this unique positioning is got to do with the fact that you are face to face with tangible objects of the past. Right? So this is the closest that you could come to the idea of experiencing history as opposed to reading or hearing about it through various sources. And at this very critical juncture, a very critical site for a public understanding of history, there are very significant knowledge gaps that I was telling you yesterday. The guidebooks are not updated. Some of them have been written in the early decades of 20th century. Have never been updated. There have been glossy pictures over that. I have talked to eyesight people myself as well. Many of those things that you see on screen travel websites are basically a repeat of the same thing with just a minor rephrasing, but they don't go into the depths of it. Many of those books or the guidebooks are also very technical at times, focus more in general. Yesterday I was talking about the tendency is more to talk about art and architecture and technical details, right? So people fall on the narratives of travel guides or tourist guides, who I was telling yesterday, they are not trained in history or in history subjects or disciplines or in university historical settings, in history settings in universities. They are trained by travel and tourism management institutes, and where the focus is more on giving you an enjoyable experience. Some of them try hard, I won't make a generalization, but the focus is giving you an enjoyable experience as opposed to an authentic one. I don't know how many of you would have gone to Fatehpur Sikri. They'll tell you every time they see a tunnel they get excited, so they'll also sing a song depending on how excited they are. So I remember twice I've gone to Fatehpur Sikri. I keep going to some sites, and he said कि आपको ये पता नहीं कि इधर से अनारकली भाग के गई थी वहाँ से होकर के. So I said कि अच्छा, and then there's a tunnel, and then he'll sing a song for you, अनारकली disco चली, and these are the kind of weird things. I'll come to some of the other parts in it now, but so tourist guides or narratives of tourist guides becomes one of them. But when we go into the consciousness and the making of popular consciousness, several other elements go into the making of it, right? It's memory, we remember events. There are events, there are stories, there are folklores, there are grandma tales connected, or basically the politics as we see it exists. And all of this has been given a new dimension by the social media, which has brought in newer set of narratives. So narratives become a very important zone of playing with monuments. And what I'm going to talk to you is I'm going to give 4 stories. I'm going to do storytelling. So I never talk with PowerPoints, but today I'm talking about PowerPoints because they are just visuals. I want to take you to those settings so that you see and what is happening over there. So that's because of that I'm using PowerPoints. So this is of course that whatever photos I used, I acknowledge them, their copyrights. And so I was talking to you about various elements that go into the making of popular consciousness. In the case of monuments, I was talking yesterday as well, there are 5 or 6 elements that make it, give it other layers and complexities, right? So for instance, human and extended human connections. In the past, it involved kings, communities. So these are groups of peoples, individuals, kings, communities, but also in the modern context, the state, basically, right? Or collectivities of people, individuals or collectivities of people. The afterlives I was talking to you about yesterday again. These are the things I talked to you, so I won't keep repeating. Afterlives is that after the death of primary or after the primary builders pass away from the scene, the monuments do not cease to exist. They continue to have new life, So events, or constructions or stories happening in the afterlife tend to give a new form or meaning to the monument or impact our way of seeing them. The monuments we see them, Larger geocultural connections, I talk about, how the monuments have bigger geocultural connections. I talk about in the presentation of North Sinha, part-whole dynamic person. Mishra was giving a very beautiful, enunciation of this thing. But in my case, it means that the structures are in conversation with each other, right? And there is a relationship between the structures and how different meanings they impart to each other, the part and the whole dynamics. And then the stories, tangible, intangible, the role of stories, the role of folklore, the role of rituals, the role of performances, the intangible part of the monument, right? Which gives, this thing. And the last one is ecological and regional dynamics, which is basically how the regional ecology or the dynamics play a role. I was yesterday giving you the example of Nalanda and Sanchi. But let me go through that. Okay. So this is, I begin with something which sounds controversial. It is not so controversial. How the gates of Somnath reach Agra Fort, So I'm taking you to Agra Fort and I'm taking you to 19th century now, right? This fort, as you know, most of you would know, was constructed by Akbar and then later, was rebuilt by Shah Jahan, right? Now, the story I have, this is the Agra Fort. And for those who have been to Agra Fort, this is from Jahangiri Mahal when you go to Anguri Bagh complex. So this is where this portion is being highlighted here. There is a small, thing there, right? Which is a covered thing there, and which is where what is kept is not in this form, but in this form. You'll see this structure, right? I'll come back to it, this structure. So this is something I'm taking you to 1840s now. So there is a Governor General who comes, Lord Ellenborough. He joins at a time when Britain and Afghanistan are having a war, basically, right? So this is around 1842 or something. He joins. And he comes forward with a declaration, a proclamation rather, addressed to the princes of North and West India, which is where he says that, we are going to get back the gates of Somnath, right? Now, what we all know is that Mahmud Ghazni raided Gujarat and many parts of India, basically. And Somnath temple becomes very important in that context because we all know that, there was a lot of looting there involved there. Right? So it was always has been there in public memory. Now, Ellenborough comes up with a narrative and then goes in for a proclamation. Proclamation means a formal, a kind of a formal declaration that we are going to get back the Somnath gates for you, and then adds one more layer to it so that we can avenge 800 years of, centuries of 8 centuries or 800 years of humiliation. Right? Now, what is that? And we, as I told you, that we all know that it was there in very public memory. Now, what the British would do is, British would, in terms of when they would, focus on history, they would also focus a lot in Turco-Persian sources, because they always felt, or they would prioritize the Turco-Persian sources because they felt that, they had better sense of chronology and sequential narratives. So the idea of dates was very important, which they thought that many of the indigenous sources did not contain that, or many of those other outside of this domain did not contain that. So he comes up with this narrative that yes, the gates of Somnath were taken away during this raid, and he says they were sandalwood gates of Somnath were taken away this Mahmud Ghazni's raid. and later put on his tomb, which is in Ghazni, right? So this picture that I showed you is the picture of his tomb, but more than this, but these are the gates, So his narrative is that he builds up, is they were put up in Mahmud Ghazni's tomb, right? So what he does is he orders General Knott, who is returning from Afghanistan, to uproot those gates and bring them to Agra. And meanwhile he issues this declaration. Now what happens is that this is a question which raised a huge uproar. Just before that, 1830s, we had this education bill coming up in the House of Commons. So there was a great interest in matters related to India. And so this matter was raised in the House of Commons as well, that are you playing to religious sentiments? So his group and his defense, there are many people come up in his defense, and they say that, look, they are not playing to religious sentiments. And then Ellenborough comes up with a narrative which is equally baffling, basically, which is that he said that, but before that, let me tell you one more thing, basically. But before that, let me just say that. First is that how did Ellenborough come to hear about this? How did he come to form, this kind of a story, basically? Now, clearly, it was not mentioned in any of the Turco-Persian sources. They talk about, raids of Mahmud Ghazni and Ferista, which is taken as the nearest in Ferista's account. Ferista says that, it had enraged the Hindus, and they were, a sense of hatred, basically. But he doesn't say that. So many of those British officials were playing with that, and it fitted very well with the narrative of divide and rule. This is also a time where they're trying to have a historical periodization of ancient, medieval, and modern. So clearly he did not do that. So there was an English officer called John Wilson, who was appointed specifically to look into the question of dates. And he comes out with an account later in 19th century. He says that there's no way he would have access to any of these. These were not mentioned anywhere in any books. So possibly some of the travelers in the desert had gone towards Elphinstone. Now Bontu Elphinstone was one of the first British, not the first, but the first British envoy to Afghanistan. He was an East India Company servant, a public affairs specialist, and somebody who weighed a big name in the field of diplomacy too. So possibly some of those travelers had informed this is based on hearsay, and then through him it passed on through the civil servant circle. It must have reached him. That is one of those. Now, he also comes up with the second part of it. At the second part of it, he says that, there is a resident who was appointed at the court of Ranjit Singh, which is in Punjab. A gentleman called Alexander Burns. And Alexander Burns mentioned that there was a talk between Ranjit Singh, who had become very dominant in that, the north and northwestern India, and Shah Shuja. Shah Shuja was the emperor of Afghanistan, who had been deposed by Dost Muhammad. So there had been an interaction between these two, in which Shah Shuja was asking Ranjit Singh for help so that he can regain the throne of Afghanistan. And Ranjit Singh apparently gave this offer, a counter offer, that if you give us the gates of Somnath, then I am ready to help you. Now, this Alexander Burns says that was Ranjit Singh wrote a letter to Shah Shuja mentioning that. The letter was never discovered or read anywhere, right? And later there was some confusion whether Ranjit Singh meant Somnath or Jagannath. And later added another level of confusion, which was if he meant Junagadh, right? More in the context of that, because Junagadh had been the subject of raids, and there are gates there which were taken away. So that is it. Meanwhile, what happens in the House of Commons, he is able to defend his followers, his supporters were able to defend that look, he is not playing to religious sentiments. So what he is trying to bring back is some kind of a national trophy, which will help Hindus deal with the feelings of humiliation. Something that has said for centuries served as a trophy of humiliation will be brought back, so it will assuage the sentiments, the political sentiments as well. So this was the narrative that was created. Now, as a result of which, what happened is that these gates were uprooted and they were brought back to Agra, where he was based there, because Agra was also where the arsenal is there. When the when this was brought back to Agra, they discovered that this was not sandalwood, but this was Devdar wood. It had Arabic inscriptions that also mentioned the name of Mahmud. And this caused them huge diplomatic embarrassment. So they decided to leave the gate in Agra fort as well. Now what happens is there are after effects as well, as I tell you, that layers and complexities in history that I talked to you about. So this is the gate. This was when it was brought back, basically this is the arsenal. Now two things where this incident is recorded in the aftermath, right? So there are two translation works which are happening. One which happens in, one is a translation of Ranchorji Amarji written in 1825, Tariq-e-Sara, and the translation happened in English translation happened in 1882. And in the translation, the edition which was translated, there was a note introduced by the editor that look, this was the gate of Somnath which was brought back in India after 800 years. There is another one which is Monier William translation of Kalidas's Abhijan Sakuntalam, where Soma, a place of pilgrimage, he mentions, I have become notorious for these gates, that were a gate. So even after this thing has been settled and been left behind, the recordings continue to happen. So when we talk about history, we need to be absolutely sure that, where they are coming from. Is there a kind of a prior history of circulation and a definite circulation? Are they feeding into a narrative, or have they been done on a basis of that? And then more recently I discovered there's an acquisition in National Army Museum which has a small piece of that gate. So it says that, see the portion in Lord Ellenborough solemnly handed the gates back to princes and chiefs of Sarhind, Rajwara, Malwa and Gujarat. And then the portion in purple, but on later examination, the gates we found turned out to have been made in Ghazni, right? So they're accepting that. But where we tend to confuse, again, an added level of confusion caused is when you go to that monument, on one hand, you have this Ghazni gate, which was put in later, but also the incident is carried forward. But parallelly, we also have the Somnath gate there, right? So it's like, what do you say? And for the tourist guides, this kind of a racy narrative is very interesting in a kind of storytelling to try. So one of the things we could do is, this has a dual existence. So perhaps we could have done away with the Somnath, gate, thing, and then narrated the whole story, which has often been described or popularly described. Just as in Fatehpur Sikri, you go and you see that Rani Jodha's Mahal is there, and then they have stories connected with that. So that was my first story, and my second story is something which is something that you will be very curious to know. All of us, whenever we go to Agra and visit Taj, which we all do sometime in the part of our life, it is both ways. We ask the tourist guides, and the tourist guides would also tell you 2 or 3 narratives in great details. One is where the hands of the artisans chopped off, right? And then it has several sub-versions of that. No. He had bought them services, so when you buy somebody's services, it's like you are chopping off the hands, or then they had thrown him out, or whether he had reached into an agreement that he would not do any kind of this thing again. So there are several versions of that article. I'm coming to the second version of that article, second version of that thing, is there is also this thing about the legend about the Black Taj. So the story is that Shah Jahan wanted to build a Taj Mahal for himself as well, right? He built one for his wife, Mumtaz Mahal, which was in white, and he wanted to build a black Taj. It's a kind of a counter image to his wife's Taj Mahal on the opposite bank of Yamuna, right? Which is now where the Mehtab Bagh is located. So this is the story which was in circulation for a very long time. Even that, the Archaeological Survey of India had to engage with it, right? But how elements of storytelling enter our popular consciousness and acquire new meanings and forms as well, right? Now, when you start digging the sources, you realize that this was first mentioned by a French traveler who was visiting Agra during that time. A traveler called Tavernier, Francis Tavernier, right? And he had visited Agra in 1640s, and then once again, so the time when Taj was being constructed, and once again after it had been constructed, which is 1660s. And then he says that Shah Jahan wanted to come up with this idea of this black Taj, but because his sons rebelled, and Aurangzeb decided to abandon the project. So that was the story he wrote. Now, later stages, the story started gaining currency. It started becoming entering of the folklore surrounding the monuments. And this is not something unique to India. You have these kind of stories everywhere around the world. North in Ireland, in Soviet Union, in Eastern Asia, parts of that. So they have left different kinds of things. Let me show you. So this is the Taj, and then by the time of Sleeman is known for putting end to thugs and thuggery, basically, right? So William Sleeman was an East India Company servant and an army man as well. By the time he visits, this had acquired the meaning of basically a different meaning. He says by then it was not only white Taj on this side, on the eastern side of on the western side of Yamuna, and black Taj on the eastern side of Yamuna, but there was also supposed to be a bridge between these two, right? So how the story starts gaining that there is a connection between these two, right? So by Sleeman's time, the story has gained further acceptance, but also has gone further, layers have been added to it. This connecting bridge was not there in the earlier version, right? And then the people would tend to justify it by saying that, look, the only asymmetrical element in the Taj Mahal is the placement of the graves. So this is Mumtaz's grave, and this is Shah Jahan's grave. He says, somebody who is being so particular about monuments, how can his grave be, asymmetrical? And this is cited as the only element of asymmetry in the Taj. Right? So now this is the element. So this is how they tried to legitimize that kind of an argument that there was a plan to do that. Now, situation became so, we started getting so much of a ground that the Archaeological Survey of India actually had to do some excavations on the other side of this thing, right? So this is what they think, and this is when I had went there. So what I discovered, or anybody would discover there, is what was the remnants of another Char Bagh. So Char Bagh is a concept, the Persian concept of garden, which is a kind of four-fold garden, very organized four-fold geometrical garden, and then within that there are certain combinations of trees which are usually found in heaven, So the idea was there was a Char Bagh in front of Taj Mahal, and there was a Char Bagh at the back of Taj Mahal, right? And when the shadows of Taj would fall, they would get a very surreal feeling, almost equal to the kind of a black Taj. Because I took this photo in the evening, so that's how it looks like basically. But this is how things come into being, and when you dig those things and you reach that, how these new levels of they start entering that and start becoming a part of popular consciousness. From there, and sometimes let me give you some other dynamics of it. Some which are more closely associated, some which we are more basically. So this is sometimes the intangible, or wherever rituals or performances, they also impact the tangible, modify the tangible. How to do that? Let me give you an example of Amravati Stupa. You may have heard about Amravati Stupa basically. This is between first and 3rd century CE. But what happens is that there is nothing which is left of this stupa now. Only the base has been left. All the portions have been taken away and have been either kept in the British museums where they kept Amravati marbles, or some elements are kept in basically the Chennai museum, right? So nothing is left. Only the base has been left. Now 2006, Dalai Lama was conducting a Kal Chakra. There's a ritual that he conducts at several places at several Buddhist sites. And the whole idea is that it is not only an initiation into which kind of facilitates your entry into Buddhahood, but also recharges the monument, right? So what happens is that, when you have when this is 2006, when this Kal Chakra Tantra was being conducted, the local, archaeology officials raised the base of the stupa, the base of what you see there. So there's an added level which was added, right? So there was a level of bricks which was added, and which was surfaced with concrete. And then what you see is that several layers of limestone sculptures, which was what Amravati was known for, were brought from local museums and put it there. And then some metal railings were also there. But what also happens is something which leaves a kind of a permanent reminder on the landscape. Around that time, a big statue of Buddha was also created, right, which is in Dhyan Mudra. And then a statue of Nagarjuna was also connected, because Nagarjuna is believed to be coming from that region, something for which we don't have a concrete evidence, but he believes to be coming from Nagarjuna Kanda, Amravati region, that kind of thing. So what you do, that you have added new tangibles. So whatever the monuments was there, you have added permanent reminders of an event, you have added new elements or new structures to an already existing heritage landscape. And let me tell you one other story which you'll find very interesting. So we talk about the Buddhas, and we talk about how the monks were supposed to stay in monasteries, right? Now the earlier period of the monasteries, till around, from the time that they were being built, till around say 5th century or something, they were usually square. So this is the square, and that is, you can see clearly, I have taken it from Sanchi. It's a square monastery, right? And there were rooms all around it, basically. Sometimes there was a space in between where you would do your prayers, but had rooms all around it, right? So this is basically Nagarjuna Kunda, that is Monastery 51 Sanchi. Now 5th century onwards, there is a new idea in the construction of monasteries that comes into being, right? Possibly discovered, possibly enunciated, possibly forcefully articulated. And this is when it was the stories that were in circulation that Buddha was an active resident of the monastery, right? So the idea was that in Benares or Shravasti earlier, where the first set of monasteries was constructed, it was held that Buddha had one of the rooms basically. There's a room there basically. But then what makes his difference in the 5th century, all the monuments, so here you have Nalanda, and that is Ajanta. And see the arrows, the blue arrows, you see there is a square thing, and towards the end, on both sides, towards the top, and there is a shrine, right? Now, how had monasteries evolved? When you see monasteries, basically, you see the center, whenever there is a monastery, and then nearby there is a stupa. So Buddha was supposed to, the stupa represented the Buddha, and monasteries, so the living and the religion, and Buddha, the residential quarters and Buddha, they were kept separately. Later times, monasteries, what happened was, some of the stupas were brought in the center of this thing, in the monastery. Sometimes you would see that in Paharpur, Samapura as well, but more in later, but earlier versions as well in Gandhara. But still, there were different structures, right? They were not same. They would be facing, from every side you would be facing the Buddha, represented by a stupa or a shrine. But there was still a difference between the residential space and the space occupied by the Buddha. Now, when you come 5th century onwards, and from here to many other things, basically, that you see, there is a new plan introduced in the monastery, and the monasteries were now had a different function. So, right as you enter the monastery, the room towards the end, there's a room towards the end, which is, there is a shrine built in all those monasteries. And this shrine was believed to be a room which was occupied by the Buddha. So Buddha becomes a permanent resident of the monasteries, medieval monasteries, right? And there were special groups of officers who were in charge of these groups called Gandhikuti Varikas. And they were at multiple places, basically. And these Gandhikuti Varikas, they were proper officials or monks in charge of this. So Nalanda, we have this. And Nalanda, you have, for different kinds of those monasteries, different Gandhikuti Varikas. And this Gandhikuti, these officials, and so Buddha was supposed to, according to the way inscriptions indicate, can own movable property, and these Gandhikuti Varikas, or these Gandhikutis as they were called, They were called Gandhakutis or perfume chambers, these shrines. They could enter into transaction with other monasteries, or transaction and correspondence with other monasteries. So the whole idea of Buddha transacting business, being a living distance, is coming live in this whole idea of the monasteries. Right? Now, what is happening in the same side? I was talking to you, giving earlier example, that the whole idea of residential space and the space occupied by Buddha is different. So now what you see here is shrine cum vihara. There's a new scheme in place in the monasteries called shrine cum vihara, and Buddha is now believed to occupy this space, and there are special people appointed to take care of him. So that's how I go into how I was telling that how the intangible, the stories also impact the architecture of the tangible. And then I'll come to one other thing where one artifact, how much time? I'm not going over, right? I have 15 minutes, so I'll finish that. So, how an artifact could have multiple lives. Some of you who have been to Mehrauli or Qutub Minar may have seen this structure called iron pillar. Let me just go through that. No. Have you seen this structure, this iron pillar? This is a small structure, this is a small artifact, which you are likely to miss if you are not conscious, but the tourist guide won't let you miss because it has a very, very interesting history. They have something that they boast of, and they should boast of, and basically it talks about India's metallurgical advances ancient times. Huge metallurgical, and there's no metal casting and metal advances. To the fact that the National Metallurgical Laboratory and Indian Institute of Metals, they both have this as their emblems, the iron pillar. So this modest looking pillar has a huge significance on history, and what they mention to you that this pillar has not rusted in the 1600 years of its existence. Scientifically exploring, what they found out it has high phosphorus and low sulfur content, but it is not rusted, and that is something that is very quickly to point out. Now, for some of you who had gone there earlier, right? Sometimes, like I have seen it happening myself, and I'm taking to you a picture from before 1850. This is Syed Ahmed Khan wrote a book called Asarul Sanad, which was basically a documentation of monuments in Delhi. Right? 1847 is the first edition, and then 1855 is the second edition, where he commissions an artist. So this is Mirza Beg, who has built it. We built a sketch of this. When you see there is a person who is trying to hold it. Now, by the time that I had gone there in 1880s, you could see a fence around it, right? And this fence had later been put up because, and I have seen it. I've seen it. This fence was put up in 1990s. So when I had gone there in late 1880s, I would see many people all the time. Whenever you enter the courtyard, you try to put it like this. And the idea was that it was harbinger of good luck. So if you are supposed to basically connect your hands together and ask for a wish, your wish would be granted. Right? Remember, a pillar who is coming from a very distant past has becoming a harbinger of good luck, and it becomes so started degrading the structure. So they had to eventually come up with that you see this barricade around that. Right, so that people don't touch. But I am going to tell you something which is some multiple lives. This pillar has gone through multiple lives. Right, this pillar. So there is an inscription here, and the inscription, the translation of the inscription for people who are interested is on the northern arcade. It was there. Anyway, the short thing is that this pillar was in front of a temple of Vishnu, right? And there was a hill there called Vishnupada. So it was on the top of the temple of Vishnu. And from there it occupied, and it talks about this is the pillar has now been dated, the inscription has now been dated to Chandragupta II, which is basically the Gupta period, 4th century, right? Which it talks about his exploits and his political conquest and things like that. So the pillar is said that this was Chandragupta's pillar. The inscription has been identified. Now when we go back and when on the basis of some archaeological and iconographic and metallurgical evidence, people have been able to identify that this was placed near Vidisha. So when you go to, any of you have gone to Vidisha, which is near Sanchi, you see the Udaygiri caves there, right? And in front of cave number 5, you would have seen, if those of you gone, there is a Varaha avatar there. right? And then, so the idea was that pillar was put in place of that. So you see the temple there, you see the, it's there here also, that thing that the temple is, and this is hills. And it also had a significance, astrological significance, astronomical significance, that, on days of summer solstice, the pillar would have a shadow that would come right of the sun. Anyway, so that was the kind of thing. And Chandragupta too, points have confirmed that he had political control over this region. And two Udaygiri caves are some caves which are directly associated with the ruler. So one part is settled. The mysteries, one part is settled, that this was belonged to the Guptas. And why it is also more important is that there is a pillar of Heliodorus, nearby. Pillar of, for those of you don't know, this is a Greek ambassador who comes from Takshila to Besnagar, which was, and joins the court of Sunga king, and converts his religion. He becomes a Bhagavata and then erects a pillar. So this is another very powerful historical post, basically that signpost that we are unable to appreciate the significance of. But this converts that yes, there was a Vaishnava cult around in this region. So this is the first life that I'm talking to you about. Now what happens to this pillar, we don't know. How did this pillar travel northwards? But 11th century onwards, this pillar starts becoming a part of the history of Rajputs. Right? Now this pillar has an inscription which says that Tomara ruler Anangapal established Delhi in 11th century. Now what the Tomars did was, Tomars were earlier more towards people who have been to Surajkund area in Delhi, who are familiar with that, more towards. So this in 11th century they come here and they settle a new fortification called Lal Kot, which became later known as the Qutub Minar, right? But Lal Kot was the first one. So they established a new thing called Lal Kot. So it was said that Tomara ruler Anangpal brought this pillar and put it in front of a temple in Lal Kot, the new fortified settlement that he had built. And this is very interestingly mentioned in a story in Prithvi. There's a Chandravardai who was a court poet of Prithviraj, who writes Prithviraj Rasu. Now that story is itself a complicated story, the story of composition, because it has obviously been added things of it later. But it comes up with a story called Kili Dhili Gatha. No, Dhili Kili Gatha, not Kili, Dhili Kili Gatha. So it says that, the story says that, there was a Brahmin who came and told Anangapal, the Delhi ruler, Rajput ruler, that this pillar rests on the hood of Vasuki, the serpent king, the mythical serpent king. And if any, and it would, all your political domains will remain stable as long as the pillar is stable. Right? Now the king, apparently, according to the story, I'm not saying it myself, but according to the story, the king gets curious and tries to uproot the pillar. And when he gets the pillar uprooted, as the story goes, he could see the lower end of the pillar smeared in blood. So he gets very nervous and he tries to put the pillar back to its original terrain, and he is unable to do that. And when he is unable to do that, the pillar remains loose. So Dhili is a word for Dhila, which is loose, and Kili, which is used for pillar. So many of those guides would tell you that Kili Dhili Gatha is also Dhili Kili Gatha is how the name of Delhi also came into being. Dhili Kili, and then combined and Delhi came into being. Obviously there have inscriptions been found in other regions which talk about this was not true, basically. But I'm trying to tell you the second part of it, that how this pillar has got a second life. Right? So what you do is an object is traveling across geographies and cultures and is acquiring new meanings and new forms as well. Right? And then from there, it was very widely believed that from there, how does it come in the center of this courtyard called, so you see this is called the Quwatul Islam Masjid, and I showed you the picture right in the very beginning. So this is in the center of this courtyard. So it was popularly believed that Qutbuddin Aibak, who conquered this area, demolished the temples of that region, because there were, all those things that are there, that demolished the temples, 27 Hindu and Jain temples, and constructed a mosque. right? And put the Siller as a kind of victory trophy, basically in the middle of it, right? But lately, in the recent past, we've discovered a text called by Samsuddin Afif, which says that Iltutmish brought it in sometime in 2020s and installed the pillar in the middle of Quwwatul Islam Mosque to perpetuate the memory of his rule. And this pillar business of reappropriating or reinscribing pillars has an old history. If you've been to Allahabad, some of you who've been to Allahabad, there's a Allahabad pillar, basically, which is the Ashokan schismatic pillar, right? So that was reinscribed by Samudragupta in 4th century and then reinscribed by Jahangir in 17th century. So pillars these are not very innocent objects when we talk about history. They have lots of layers and complexities to it, which go on into the making of our consciousness or go on to the making of this thing, basically. So this was my third story, and coming back to my last story is how Bodh Gaya becomes a mini Asia, right? So let me just tell you that this is the first thing. So Buddha, I've taken it from the painting at Mulagandhi, Behar, Savna. So Buddha is, the purpose is that Buddha is under a tree, he gets enlightenment, and these are the first representations. So this is from Bharut, and this is how Cunningham discovered. So what Ashoka does, so the first set of monuments or structures that were built in. So Buddha has now gone away from the scene. He attained enlightenment. The first set of structures were being by Ashoka. So what Ashoka does is Ashoka erects a kind of a platform, a throne, what they would call, is to demarcate the exact space where Buddha attained enlightenment. So this is right behind the tree. When you go there, it's right behind the tree. So this is how Cunningham excavated it, and this is how there is a depiction of it in Bharu. So it's like a tree shrine. You can see that there is a tree shrine. The followers who are worshipping it. So there is a tree shrine, and this is how he discovered it. Ashoka is believed to have a pillar, which any of you who've gone to Bodh Gaya will see that also. But this neither has the characteristic Mauryan polish, or neither has any inscriptions that you can conclusively prove that. But so it is popularly believed that Ashoka has been there. The next phase comes when the railings are constructed around this. So these railings are not original railings. These are railings which are replica. The original railings is kept in the museum, the site museum, right? So these are replicas. So the next phase is that, the Sunga period when the railings are constructed, and then railings are added to in the Gupta period. And then 5th century onwards, Bodh Gaya has emerged as a strong center of pilgrimage, both within the country and outside of the country. So there is a settlement of, as early as 6th century BC, there is a settlement of Sri Lankan monk community there. There's an inscription of Mahanam which talks about that. And then from there, people from China, from Burma, they are all continuously coming in there. They are doing in 11th, 12th century, you have evidence of repairs as well. And what they're doing is when you come to a pilgrimage site, you leave behind something as a mark of your center to pilgrimage. So either you have steels, or you build stone Bodhi stupas and leave there, or you build small or images of Buddha and leave there. So the whole area had become inundated with artifacts. So 4th century to around 12th century, lot of things are happening in and around the site where Buddha had attained nirvana. And then around 8th to 12th century, lot of sculptures are also coming to being. This is from the mud which is there. I got these pictures from the mud. So many of the sculptures are actually kept in the mud. Some have been put back in the Bodh Gaya compound, in the Mahabodhi temple compound, but lot of them still remain in the mud, basically, right? And then, so this is the mud's temple. This is where the Mahant sits, the Mahant, he was a follower of Shaivism, basically, who had come to Bodh Gaya in around 15th, 16th century and established a mud and remained there. So many of the sculptures are there. And then this is also something which is in 11th, 12th century, that, the main temple thing, that main icon that you see there. After that, around 12th and 13th centuries, this idea, the Bodh Gaya starts declining, basically. There are various reasons assigned to it. The Bodh Gaya starts declining. And the idea of Bodh Gaya starts acquiring overseas roots. So there are different ways in which it manifests. One is large size replicas, which is like this. This is Wat Jaipur. This is the Chiang Mai thing in Thailand, which is the Mahabodhi temple in Burma, and also miniature models, right, which you find in different museums across the world. So the whole idea is that if you cannot go to the site, you have a virtual pilgrimage. So you see that, and you consider your pilgrimage done. So when it's difficult to visit the site, then you have the idea of virtual pilgrimage coming into being. What I'm also trying to say that, and Jeta had asked me this question, that do you think that you will be able to tell something where the original intention of the original builders and whatever happens later is different? So whatever the monument that shape acquires is different from the intentions of the original builders, basically. So therefore I thought, why not bring this up? So one thing which has, beginnings in 3rd century BC, has started acquiring new meanings and forms, becomes a part of pilgrimage circuit and Ashoka. Then there is different people are rivaling different, dynasties in India and abroad are rivaling to patronize the site, because it's the whole idea is to bring in merit making, right? So if you are earning merit, basically if you are doing something at a place where Buddha was born. And then finally, the colonial restoration happens. So this is before and after colonial restoration. And this is very interesting way, how the colonial empire uses this restoration exercise to assert its ownership in the Indian territory, but also in terms of heritage management. So he says, I am the master, right? So in the earlier tradition, many of this, the temple continued to receive, delegates from Myanmar, and one of those, the delegates had come in 1870s, and they sought the permission of the Mahant to repair the temple, because the Mahant was then in charge of the temple, and this irks the British. He says, you should be asking us, we are the masters, right? And that is when they first say that, okay, you will go, you will be supervised. So Rajendra Lal Mitra was the person who was asked to supervise that, basically. And then they said, no, we are going to renovate. You just, vacate this thing. And what they did was came up with this new, so they completely rebuilt this whole structure. And in the process, that's a different story that I'll tell, that rebuilding exercise, many of the elements were lost, and they do not conform to the principles of that. But more important, what they were trying to convert is treat a sacred space as an archaeological space, or an archaeological monument, right? So this is what happens. And then you have India attains independence, and then Bodh Gaya comes back again in that domain, and it again becomes from an archaeological monument, it becomes a sacred monument. It's the one of the only world, not one of the only World Heritage Site which is not managed by ASI. It's managed by the Temple Committee, Mahabodhi Temple Committee, right? So this is from archaeological monument, it again becomes a sacred monument, and then there is a Bodh Gaya Management Temple Committee. This is also the time when Nehru realizes that Bodh Gaya is going to become a very important space in terms of political diplomacy, in terms of building networks with the newly independent regions in East Asia, right? So many of those people were started giving powers. There was a new organization made, the advisory board was constructed, and many of those foreign countries which had significant Buddhist presence were asked to build monasteries and temples in Bodh Gaya, right? So this is a very strong element of what we call, soft diplomacy. I was told by a diplomat that there's nothing called soft power. Power and soft don't exist. So I'm not using soft power. I've become very conscious about that after. So there's a part of this diplomacy circle. And then 5 minutes, right? Not 2 minutes. No, I'm done. Mostly done. In 2 minutes I'm done. Okay. So this is, but how I want to tell you is that after that also, this is 1989, that there is a new thing which is erected here. Then there is something which is, this is created here. There's in the SARC diplomacy, 1990 Sri Lanka does it, they build a ground. And this is Sahasra Stupa, which certainly comes up in 1990s, which is basically, all the stupas they had, they collected them and built what they call the Sahasra Stupa. So added, so when you go enter the temple, be conscious when you look at the right. So the Shastra Stupa comes up, which is a conglomeration of all the existing stupas, votive stupas and images. And then those things that I was talking to you about, so the whole area becomes Buddhified. So these are monasteries, which have started coming in and around Bodh Gaya. They follow their own architectural style. And then, giant Buddhas, so the whole idea of the Buddhification of the space starts happening around that. Mostly with mostly where foreign powers were involved. And then also the landscape starts changing. So you have this local now Sanskriti Kendra come up, and this place which is where the Dalai Lama would conduct, basically Kal Chakra, has also become known as the Kal Chakra Maidan. This was just a temporary measure, basically, that has started happening. And how sometimes, just I want to leave you this image, how sometimes this happens by replication of a cultural memory. So something that was Sanchi, you see that in the Rashtrapati Bhavan, this is Ambedkar. So now he just got tied up with identity politics, right? So the place where Ambedkar got converted to Buddhism has now got this thing. These are Mayavati parks in Lucknow, right? Which again, ties up with Bahujan Samaj politics. Here it ties up with Ambedkar's, basically, and then there's a build-up, and you guys who have Calcutta, you people are Calcutta people, so you know it so well, basically. Then this is Ambedkar Memorial, and this is Ashanti Stupa in Delhi, right? So all of them, how the cultural memory is institutionalized, and I leave you finally with this, I'll not talk about, but how the Lal Killa or the Red Fort, which was built up as a kind of a Killa Mubarak or an exalted fort in 17th century Mughal capital Shahjahanabad, started acquire different meanings over a period of time, and it involved finally, when you asked me that question, that how did it become a site of, it was because of Subhash Chandra Bose, basically. Yeah. So Subhash Chandra Bose visited the unmarked grave of Bahadur Shah Jafar, where he gave the slogan Delhi Chalo, and then we'll fly the flag of victory in the Red Fort itself. And that is when it comes back again in the center stage. Before that, it had already had a life during 1857 as a seat of rebellion, and then as a kind of repression of that rebellion, where the British barracks have started coming out. So when you see the barracks, they are not native to the construction plan. They have come up later, and it was marked, and they are seen as a sign of suppression of a popular rebellion. And finally, when it does that, so, and then after that, when Subhash Chandra Bose sets up this INA, many of those when they are defeated, the prisoners are brought here, and they decided to set up a public example that they'll hold public trials in Red Fort. That completely backfired. So the INA trials brought back Red Fort again, basically in public memory, and then things started getting out of control. And Nehru, when he did this first flag hoisting, specifically remembered Subhash Chandra Bose's contribution to that. So that's the story. I'll do that. I'll stop